On the storm-lashed ridges of Copper Ridge, Evelyn Harper lived as if half-buried with her husband in the frozen ground, silent, dutiful, resigned. But when a half-starved boy staggered to her cabin one night, begging only for food and a chance to work, she faced a choice that would awaken everything she thought was dead inside her. What began as an act of mercy soon grew into a bond of survival, love, and defiance, strong enough to stand against gossip, greed, and the merciless hand of winter itself. The wind howled through the pine hollows of Copper Ridge as twilight smothered the sky in steel-gray silence. Inside her modest timber cabin, Evelyn Harper stirred a pot of stew over the crackling fire, her mind miles away, lost in memory, not warmth. 3 winters had passed since her husband was buried beneath the frozen soil behind the barn. Since then she had lived quietly, not quite broken, but not quite alive either. The mountains gave her solitude, and she accepted it as her penance. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft, uneven tapping against the wooden door, almost swallowed by the rising storm. Evelyn froze, ladle still in hand. Few souls ventured this far into the timberlands without purpose, and none ever came this close to nightfall. Her fingers hovered over the latch. Part of her screamed to bolt it shut. The other part, the older, quieter part that still remembered what it meant to care, told her to look. She eased toward the door and peered through the frost-laced window. A shadow shifted just outside. Not tall, not steady. She saw a figure young, hunched beneath a threadbare coat, snow gathering on his shoulders like ash. His hands trembled as they knocked again, slower now, as if each tap was a struggle. Evelyn opened the door just a crack. Standing there was a boy, maybe 17, though hardship had stolen his softness. His cheeks were hollow, his lips blue, his breath visible in sharp gasps. Snow clung to his dark hair in thick clumps. His boots were soaked through, and he clutched his arms like someone bracing for death. I ain't eaten in 4 days, ma'am," he whispered. "I don't want nothing for free. I'll split wood, fix things, anything. Just, please." The words cracked like dry kindling. Evelyn didn't speak. She didn't need to. With a quiet motion, she unlatched the door and stepped aside. The boy stumbled in with a groan. She caught him before he fell, feeling bones beneath worn wool. He was light, too light. She helped him to the fireside and wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. "What's your name, son?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "Levi Ransom," he murmured, leaning into the warmth. "Been walking near 50 miles since the fever took my folks. Just been moving west, looking for work. Or luck." Evelyn ladled stew into a bowl and handed it to him. She watched as he lifted the spoon slowly, careful not to spill a drop, as if each bite was sacred. Despite his hunger, he didn't wolf it down. He had manners, the kind taught by a mother long gone. Most drifters who passed through only saw what her cabin lacked, but Levi looked around like he'd stumbled into a cathedral, not grand, but safe. His eyes lingered not on her possessions, but on the warmth, the quiet. It was the look of someone who'd gone too long without kindness. "You'll sleep here tonight," she said simply. "Storm's set to get worse, and you wouldn't make it far." Levi blinked, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, ma'am. I swear I won't be no trouble." Evelyn nodded, then turned back to the firearms, crossed tight. But something inside her, something old and soft and stubborn, had shifted. She'd taken in strays before, a lost dog, an orphaned lamb. But this was different. This was a boy on the edge of manhood, a boy with nowhere else to go, and in his hollow eyes she saw not only desperation, but recognition. Neither of them knew it then, but that single act, opening her door on a snowy night, would set in motion a storm more powerful than the one outside. A storm of gossip, judgment, and love. And by the time the snow melted, the mountain would remember Evelyn Harper and Levi Ransom as the two souls who dared to stand against it all together. The morning after the storm, Evelyn Harper rose before dawn. The mountains were blanketed in thick white silence, and the chimney's faint smoke curled like a promise into the blue-gray sky. Inside, the hearth had burned low, but not out. She moved carefully, lighting the oil lamp on the mantel and setting a kettle to boil. She didn't speak at first, habit perhaps, or maybe because she wasn't sure if the boy was still there, or just a vision brought on by loneliness and winter dreams. But when she turned, she saw him, Levi Ransom, curled near the hearth in the blanket she'd wrapped around him, his face half lit by the dying glow. His boots, now dry, had been lined neatly by the door, and though he'd stirred at her movements, he hadn't spoken either. There was an odd peace in the silence between them. No need to fill the room with noise. The fire did the talking. When he finally sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes, Evelyn handed him a chipped cup of hot tea. He took it carefully, like he was afraid to drop it. "You didn't have to let me stay," he said, his voice still scratchy with cold. "You didn't give me much choice," she replied, but there was a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I don't turn away things the Lord puts on my doorstep." He chuckled softly. "I ain't exactly a blessing." Evelyn studied him. Thin but strong-boned, dirt under his nails but clean hands, scar on his brow that didn't look self-inflicted, and eyes, those gray-blue eyes that didn't belong to a liar. "Give it time," she said, and began cracking eggs into a skillet. That day, Levi didn't just eat and leave. He stayed. When she stepped outside to split kindling, he followed without asking, took the axe from her hands apologetically, and began chopping with clean, even strokes. She noticed the way he staggered a bit, at first still weak from days without food, but how he never once stopped. His determination was stitched into every movement, as if earning his place here meant something more than survival. Over the next few days, a rhythm formed between them, slow but solid. He helped with the animals, feeding the goats, mending a broken section of fencing. She taught him how to stack the wood properly, how to store root vegetables against mold, how to patch the leaky corner of the barn. Evelyn found herself saying things out loud she hadn't said in years, not because she was lonely, but because he listened. He asked smart questions, too. About the weather, about preserving meat, about how to tell if a bear had crossed the trail by the ridge. "Did your folks teach you to work like this?" she asked one evening, as he hung a lantern by the shed. He nodded. "Pa was a farmer. Mom kept books. We didn't have much, but we did things proper. Lost 'em both when the fever came through Lark Hollow. She didn't press further. She just said, 'I'm sorry,' and meant it." In return, he said nothing, just nodded and stared out at the trees like the wind might answer back. What surprised Evelyn wasn't how quickly the boy adapted, it was how much she began looking forward to the sound of his boots on the porch, or the way he hummed while sharpening tools. It had been so long since she'd heard another human voice under this roof, longer still since it had brought comfort instead of obligation. At night, Levi slept in the lean-to. He repaired himself just off the back of the cabin near the woodpile, but he always joined her at the table for supper. He never took more than his share, and always offered to wash the dishes. She let him, though. At first it felt strange, like giving over a sacred ritual. Her late husband had been a good man, but he'd never touched a dish in 20 years. One evening she caught Levi whittling on the porch small wooden animals smoothed at the edges. A deer, a mule, a squirrel with oversized ears. "These are for kids," he explained, a little embarrassed, "if I ever find myself with a family again." Evelyn didn't laugh. She just said, "That deer's legs are too long," and he grinned. Winter stretched on, but the days no longer felt so hollow. Evelyn found herself setting aside an extra blanket, extra food, not out of pity, but out of habit born from care. She began to wonder what the neighbors, if they were even watching, might think. But then she remembered up here the only things watching were trees and sky. Still, every now and then, when she'd catch Levi standing shirtless in the snow, scrubbing his clothes by the creek, something would twist inside her. Not shame, not desire exactly, but something older and heavier. A recognition. That he was no longer the half-starved boy who knocked on her door. He was becoming a man right before her eyes. His shoulders were broader, his voice deeper, his gaze steadier. He no longer asked permission before fixing things or offering help. He just did it. And Evelyn, though she would never admit it aloud, felt her heart stir, not with lust, but with fear. Fear that she was starting to need him, not just his labor, but his presence, his quiet steadiness, his way of seeing her not as a relic or charity case, but as a woman still capable of building something. Of all the things she'd lost since her husband's death, the hardest to let go of was the idea that her story might already be over. But then came Levi Ransom walking out of the woods like a page from some forgotten chapter. And suddenly her life had a second beginning. Spring came late that year. The snow melted in stubborn patches, leaving behind soggy soil and brittle branches. Evelyn Harper planted her garden with practiced patience while Levi Ransom repaired the rotted section of the chicken coop. They worked in tandem, wordless but in rhythm, like two instruments tuned to the same weathered melody. Evelyn didn't speak of the passage of time, but she noticed it all the same. 6 months had passed since the boy had first staggered to her door. He was taller now, stronger. His face had lost its hollow desperation, and in its place was resolve. They still slept apart, he in the lean-to, she in the cabin, but every evening they shared a meal, and in the morning they worked side by side. Evelyn told herself it was practical, that a woman alone needed help and a boy without direction needed purpose. But deep down a quieter truth stirred. She looked forward to his voice in the morning and dreaded the thought of silence returning. Out here in the wild hush of the timberline, they were just two people trying to survive. But beyond the ridge where pine gave way to fields and town gossip traveled faster than weather, their arrangement had not gone unnoticed. It began innocently enough. A woman named Virginia Whitcomb stopped by under the pretense of looking for wild mint along the creek. Evelyn invited her in out of courtesy. The woman declined, but lingered outside, noting the extra boots by the door, the shirt drying on a wooden peg, the faint sound of humming from the lean-to behind the house. She said nothing, but her silence said everything. Within a week, Evelyn noticed the change. When she rode into the settlement for flour and salt. The conversation stopped the moment she entered. Reverend Malachi Jones no longer greeted her with his usual stiff nod, and Agnes Pike, who once traded canned peaches for goat's milk, now turned her back entirely. It was the kind of quiet judgment that didn't raise its voice. It just tightened its lips and whispered when you passed. Levi noticed it too. One morning after returning from the trading post, he dropped his saddlebag on the porch and said, "Folks stared like I was dragging a dead horse behind me." "You're not from here," Evelyn replied, trying to brush it off. "That ain't why, and you know it." She didn't answer, but her grip on the banister tightened. What neither of them knew was that the whispers had become a ledger. Virginia had begun keeping a written account not for law, but for the court of public opinion. She noted when Levi entered the cabin and when he left, when he chopped wood shirtless, or when Evelyn walked with him to the lower pasture. She wrote it all down day by day until it was no longer a journal. It was an indictment. Then came the visit. On a humid afternoon in early May, 3 riders approached the cabin. Evelyn recognized them the moment they dismounted: Reverend Jones, Grant Holloway, and Edgar Whitcomb, each dressed in Sunday black, as if mourning what they claimed to be moral decay. Reverend Jones stepped forward. "Mrs. Harper, we'd like a word." Levi was on the porch, sharpening a draw knife. He stood slowly and placed the blade on the railing. "This about me?" he asked calmly. "Son, you're the reason we're here," Holloway answered. "There's been concern about your arrangement." "My presence," Levi said, voice cool, "has kept this homestead running. I earn my keep. That's not what's in question," Whitcomb said, opening a worn satchel. "It's the nature of your cohabitation." He handed Evelyn a folded document, a stack of handwritten entries, each time stamped. The paper shook slightly in her hands as she read phrases like, "Watched him bathe shirtless in the creek," and sat close over shared stew bowls. Her face flushed not with guilt, but fury. "Who wrote this?" "My wife," Whitcomb replied, trying to sound noble. She feared for the example it set for younger women in the community. "So she spied on us?" Levi said, stepping closer. "She twisted meals and work and kindness into sin." "It's not about sin," Holloway cut in. "It's about decency, about the perception of impropriety." Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "You mean it's about control?" Reverend Jones raised a hand. "We're giving you a chance to make this right. The boy can take lodging at the mission in town. You'll be left to your privacy, but separate." "And if we don't?" she asked. Jones hesitated. "Then we'll be forced to bring it before the circuit judge. Question your mental clarity given your recent losses and unusual decisions." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise cloaked in religious concern. They rode away before sunset, leaving behind dust silence and a sense of betrayal that clung like smoke. Levi stood at the porch rail long after they were gone, his jaw set hard. "They don't care about decency," he muttered. "They care about keeping you quiet, keeping me invisible." Evelyn didn't disagree. She just stared at the papers in her hand, all the little details of her life turned into weapons. Her hand trembled not from fear, but from a deeper ache. For the first time in years, she had opened her heart, allowed someone close, and the world had come knocking not to celebrate it, but to extinguish it. That night she couldn't sleep. The old cabin felt suddenly watched, vulnerable. Every creak in the floorboard sounded like accusation. Levi sat at the edge of the firelight, whittling again. Not animals this time, but shapes. Sharp ones. Arrows. Points. "They're going to come back," he said quietly. She nodded. "We need to be ready." Neither spoke of what that meant, but between them lay a silence heavier than any storm, the kind that only comes when two people realize that love, once questioned, must either retreat or be defended. The days after the confrontation with Reverend Jones and the others felt like walking through a forest, where every branch might break beneath your step. Evelyn Harper kept her routines, feeding the hens, boiling water for bread, mending a fence post that had been knocked loose by wind. But each task felt more exposed now, like someone might be watching her hands, timing her steps. Levi Ransom, too, had grown quieter. He still rose before dawn, still stacked wood, still repaired tools with quiet precision, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a heaviness in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. What had once been a sanctuary had shifted into something brittle, ready to snap. They didn't speak much that week, but their silences grew heavier, more telling than words. Evelyn would glance up from the table and catch Levi staring into the fire with a kind of haunted focus, not fear, but something more dangerous, a simmering restraint. At night, she no longer felt safe enough to leave the windows uncovered. The oil lamp burned lower, and the shadows inside the cabin grew longer. Then on the fourth morning, something neither of them expected happened. A knock came at the door. Not hard, not frantic, but cautious. Evelyn stiffened where she stood, ladle in hand. Levi was already on his feet, gripping the handle of the axe he'd left near the hearth. But when Evelyn eased the door open, it wasn't a group of men. It was Virginia Whitcomb. She looked different now. Not proud, not cold. Her cheeks were pale, and she wrung her hands like someone holding something sharp. She carried no satchel, no papers, just a leather-bound book pressed tight against her chest. "Please," she said, voice almost inaudible. "I need to speak with both of you, alone." Levi didn't move from the corner. Evelyn stepped aside, slowly nodding toward the table. Virginia crossed the threshold like a woman entering a graveyard. "I've wronged you," she said, sitting down and resting the book between her palms. "Both of you." Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "You're the one who's been writing our lives into your little ledger." That wasn't concern. That was surveillance. Virginia flinched, but didn't argue. "You're right. At first I was watching for sin. That's what I told myself. I thought if I documented enough, I could prove to my husband and the others that what you were doing here was improper, unchristian. But—" She paused as if the words themselves had weight. "But that's not what I saw." Levi stepped closer, arms crossed. "What did you see?" Then Virginia looked up at them with eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness. "I saw her spoon broth into your mouth when you were too fevered to lift your hand. I saw you hang that crooked horseshoe by the door for luck the same way her husband used to. I saw the way you watched each other, not with shame, but with care, and I realized something awful. I envied it. Because my marriage, it's cold and correct and lifeless. And what you had here was real." Evelyn swallowed hard, but said nothing. Virginia opened the book. "This isn't the same one the men have. That was for their eyes, the edited version. This is what I actually wrote." She turned it toward them. Pages filled with loopy script smudged ink and dozens of entries. None sounded scandalous. Instead, they read like poetry, quiet descriptions of two people growing close in the shadow of snowstorms and supper bowls. He gave her his coat when she forgot hers. She waited for him at the ridge. They laughed today. "I didn't mean to betray you," Virginia whispered. "But I did. Because when they came to me asking for ammunition to take you down, I handed them what they wanted, even if it wasn't the truth." Levi exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his brow. "Then why are you here now?" Virginia looked down at her lap, voice trembling. "Because they're planning to come back tomorrow. Not with Bibles this time. With paperwork. With deputies. They've already written the petition to have Evelyn declared mentally unfit for moral decision-making. They're calling it female instability from prolonged isolation. They think if they prove she's hysterical, they can commit her to the territorial asylum. Evelyn went cold all over. She had heard the stories. Women sent away for nervous complaints never to return. Forced sedation. Chains. Silence. "And you?" Evelyn asked, voice like flint. "What do they plan for?" "Levi." Virginia glanced at him with something close to apology. "They want you arrested for moral exploitation of a widow for taking advantage of her fragile state. Grant Holloway spoke to the sheriff yesterday. They're framing it as corruption, predation. He says your presence is a stain on the territory's reputation." Levi's knuckles whitened around the back of the chair. "They want the land," Virginia said, finally letting the truth out. Evelyn blinked. "The land?" "Yes. Your husband filed a silver claim just before his death. Holloway discovered the paperwork last fall in the office archives. That vein runs right under your eastern ridge, rich wide and mostly untouched. If you're institutionalized, the state can sell your property to pay for your care. And guess who already filed interest in purchasing it for pennies? Evelyn's legs nearly gave out. She steadied herself against the counter, heart pounding. All those warnings about decency and community values had been a smokescreen, an orchestrated campaign to strip her of everything. Her land, her dignity, her mind. You didn't just spy, Evelyn said slowly. You armed them. I know, Virginia said softly. That's why I'm here, to try somehow to undo the harm. She slid the journal across the table. This is yours now, every honest word. If they take me down for perjury or obstruction, so be it. But this might help you prove your truth. Then she stood pausing at the threshold. I'll delay them. I'll feign sickness, scatter the papers, burn the wagon wheel if I must. But it won't buy you more than a day. Evelyn met her eyes. Why do this now? Virginia hesitated. Because I remembered what it felt like to want something good and be told I didn't deserve it. And because if someone doesn't stand between you and them, they'll erase you. She left before either could speak again. That night, Evelyn sat by the fire, the journal open across her lap, reading words written by a former enemy who had witnessed not scandal but intimacy in its quietest form. And Levi sat beside her, his hands balled in his lap, his jaw rigid. They're coming for us, he said. And this time they won't knock. Evelyn looked at him. Then we don't wait. We make the first move. That night the cabin was no longer quiet. A storm of decisions churned between Evelyn Harper and Levi Ransom, not the kind made with rage or impulse, but with the terrifying clarity of people who had nothing left to lose. The threat from Grant Holloway and Reverend Jones wasn't just theoretical anymore. It was coming wrapped in legal papers, twisted logic, and the smug certainty of men who had built their entire sense of order on keeping people like Evelyn silent and alone. We could run, Levi said quietly, his voice barely louder than the wind scratching at the window panes. They can't take what they can't find. Evelyn shook her head from where she stood near the cold stove. This land is mine. My husband is buried here. My name is still carved into the barn door. If I leave, I become the ghost they already think I am. Levi stepped toward her. Then we fight. Evelyn turned her face pale but resolute. There's one way to make their accusations meaningless. One way to turn their shame into something powerless. She looked him in the eye, unflinching. We get married. The words hung in the air like smoke, not romantic, not desperate, simply true, a legal act, a shield, a declaration. Levi didn't flinch. He crossed the room and took her hands gently in his, the calluses on his fingers brushing hers like old paper. I've been waiting to hear you say that, he whispered. Not out of fear, but because I've already made that choice in my heart. She smiled faintly. Then let's do it before they come with shackles and lies. They had one shot. Levi remembered a trapper living farther up the ridge, Harlan Sutter, a solitary man rumored to be a retired preacher. No one had seen him in months, but if he still drew breath, he might be their only chance. They saddled their horses in the dark, packing only what they needed, an old dress, a pen, a Bible, and a courage neither had expected to use this way. The ride through the high mountain trails was treacherous. Fog clung low and heavy. The moon played hide-and-seek behind clouds. Twice Evelyn's mare stumbled on slick shale, but Levi was always there steadying her. Neither spoke much. There was no need to. Between them was the quiet understanding of two souls who had already chosen one another, not in front of an altar, but in all the moments that came before the shared coffee, the patched roofs, the silent evenings mending torn gloves beside the fire. Just before dawn, they reached Sutter's cabin, a weather-beaten shack tucked against a split of pine and stone. Levi knocked once. Twice. No answer. Then a third time. A light flickered inside. When the door creaked open, Harlan Sutter stood with a rifle in one hand and a flask in the other. He squinted through bushy brows, eyes narrowing on the pair standing on his porch in the half-light of dawn. Marriage. He grunted once. Levi explained. This time of day. What kind of trouble are you dragging behind you? The kind that wears black robes and calls love a sickness, Evelyn replied. Sutter looked at her for a long time, then at Levi. Finally, he nodded once and let them in. The ceremony was brief-spoken beneath rough-hewn beams and watched only by Sutter's old dog and a crackling fire. Harlan's voice, though gravel-thick, softened as he recited the vows. To honor and keep in storm and stillness, in silence and in voice. When he finally said, "You may kiss your bride," Levi did, and in that kiss was not just love, but defiance. A claim not just on each other, but on the right to decide their lives for themselves. Sutter handed over the signed marriage certificate stamped and sealed. You'd best ride fast, he warned. Saw riders heading toward your place just before sunup, looked like men with torches, and trouble. They did not rest. They galloped hard back down the pass, the wind biting at their faces. Evelyn held the certificate tight to her chest, the ink still drying. As they approached the homestead, Levi slowed. They could see 6 riders already dismounted surrounding the cabin like wolves. Torches lit the yard in flickering orange and gold. Grant Holloway stood at the front, a rolled scroll in hand, his face twisted in smug certainty. Beside him, Reverend Jones held his Bible like a blade. Mrs. Harper Holloway called, "We know you're inside. Come out and accept what must be done." But Evelyn and Levi didn't ride in through the front gate. They came around the eastern slope, visible only when the rising sun caught their silhouettes on horseback. The men turned, startled. Evelyn sat tall in the saddle, her dress rustling in the morning breeze. "You're right, Holloway. Something's changed since yesterday." She dismounted and handed the paper to Jones, who unrolled it with trembling hands. "By the authority of the territorial charter," she said, her voice clear and firm, "I am now Evelyn Ransom, and the man you've accused of impropriety is my lawful husband." Jones stared at the certificate, his face paling. "This is signed, witnessed, official," he stammered. "Boaz McKinley wasn't available," Levi added dryly. "But Harlan Sutter still remembers how to hold a wedding." The crowd of men murmured. One of the younger deputies shifted in his saddle. The unity, the righteousness of their cause, it all wavered under the weight of cold legal truth. "You think a piece of paper changes anything?" Holloway snapped. "I think it changes everything Evelyn said, including your plan to steal my land under the guise of moral concern." "You've made a mistake," Jones hissed. "You'll still answer to the community." "No," Levi said, stepping between them. "You'll answer to the law if you keep pushing." More than one rider turned their horse around, then unsure. The circle of men shrank. Holloway's glare burned with frustrated greed, but his options had run dry. The bluff had been called and lost. As the men rode off silent and defeated, Evelyn turned to Levi. His hand found hers warm and steady. They stood there together just beyond the porch as the sun crept up behind them. Not fugitives, not outcasts, husband and wife. And for the first time in months, the wind that passed through the hollow carried not whispers of shame, but the hush of peace hard won. In the seasons that followed, the whispers faded not because the townsfolk changed their hearts, but because Evelyn and Levi Ransom no longer gave them power. The marriage certificate was posted on the church bulletin board for a month straight. No one dared tear it down. No one dared approach the cabin again with accusations in hand. And Grant Holloway, once the loudest voice of moral outrage, was quietly stripped of his claim on the Harper property when the mining officials arrived and found everything above board. There had been no corruption, no scandal, only a legal union and a newly registered silver vein under the name E. Ransom and Spouse. They never mined it themselves. Instead, Evelyn and Levi leased the rights to a trusted operator taking just enough income to rebuild the homestead, expand the pasture, and stock the cellar with more than root vegetables and dried beans. Levi bought Evelyn a new cook stove, black iron with polished nickel trim, and installed it himself. Evelyn gave Levi an old Winchester her husband had once cherished, the initials now carved beside Levi's own. Visitors still came from time to time. Strangers, travelers, even a few women who had once crossed the street to avoid Evelyn's gaze now brought wild jam or fresh linens as gifts, not apologies, but olive branches. Some sought advice. Others just needed to see with their own eyes what real defiance wrapped in decency looked like. But the most common visitors were children. Every spring and fall, Levi carved new toys from leftover pine horses, eagles, even a lopsided cow with mismatched eyes, and left them in a basket at the edge of the property. No name, no price. Just a quiet offering from a man who had once knocked on a stranger's door with nothing but hunger and hope. And Evelyn, she taught reading again. Not in a schoolhouse, she never returned to town life, but at the kitchen table surrounded by wildflowers and the scent of warm bread. Children came by mule or wagon. She had no chalkboard, but she had patience, and that was enough. She never raised her voice. She never had to. Her voice had already changed the course of her life. Years passed. Levi built a second room onto the cabin and lined it with books. A cradle followed. And though some still whispered about their age gap, those whispers eventually gave way to reverence. Not everyone could understand the kind of love they had, but no one could deny it existed because it lasted. When the first frost of their 5th winter arrived, Evelyn stood on the porch in a wool shawl, watching the valley turn silver again. Levi joined her arms wrapped around her waist. "Still think we should have run?" she asked, leaning into his chest. He smiled, brushing snow from her hair. Running would have kept us alive, but staying made us real. And so the mountain remembered them not for scandal, but for standing when others knelt, for choosing each other when the world offered only judgment, for taking something broken, a boy without a future, and a woman cast aside, and turning it into something strong, enduring, and fiercely theirs. They were never trying to make a point. They were just trying to make a life. And in the end, that was the point. If this story stirred your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more powerful tales from the untamed frontier. At Whispers of the West, we bring you stories of love, resilience, and redemption, where every silence speaks volumes. Your support keeps these voices alive. Ride with us into the next chapter.